We often want to get rid of our bad feelings like anxiety, anger, low mood, etc. But there are evolutionary good reasons why we have those feelings, and even if we're not being chased by lions nowadays normally, um, there are still some instances where feeling those bad feelings is quite functional. And today's guest, Randy Nesse, is an expert in this field called evolutionary psychiatry, and we'll be talking about when those bad feelings are good and when they are not good in a way. So I hope you have fun. And yeah, let's go. Good. So Randy Nesse, welcome to the Painting Onions podcast. Thank you so much for taking your time.
Thanks so much. I look forward to it, Lorenz.
So this podcast is about your book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings. And it's connected to the field of evolutionary psychiatry. And before we go into the book, I would like to ask, what's evolutionary psychiatry about?
You know, it's just using the basic science of evolutionary biology to better understand mental disorders. In the rest of medicine, routinely tries to figure out what the pancreas is for and what the thyroid is for. And in psychiatry, we haven't been doing that. We've just been trying to jump in and understand disease without understanding what normal is first. And there's a great hope that finally bringing in this evolutionary biology, which is the foundation for understanding all behavior of other creatures, will finally put psychiatry on a more solid foundation.
You make a huge, not huge, but a big, important difference between viewing mental disorders as adaptations and symptoms as adaptations. Could you maybe clarify those two views and why one is better than the other?
Yes, thanks so much for bringing that up, Lorenz, because that is really central to the whole enterprise. One thing I argue is that there's a fundamental mistake at the root of a lot of modern psychiatry, and that is confusing symptoms with diseases. And if you go to the doctor with pain, with abdominal pain, or with cough, or with fever, the doctor doesn't say you have cough disease or fever disease. The doctor says, hey, let's try to see if there's something arousing this bad feeling that you have. But if you go to a psychiatrist and you have anxiety or depression, you're liable to hear, oh my gosh, you have anxiety disorder or depression disorder, without even looking carefully to find what might be arousing it. Actually, a good psychiatrist and a good psychologist too will always look to try to figure out what might be going on in your life to arouse those symptoms. But the research focuses all on assuming there's something wrong with someone's brain if they have too much anxiety or depression. And sometimes that's for sure the case. We need to keep looking for those. But the theme of evolutionary psychiatry on the one hand is that these bad feelings are there for good reasons. That's why I called the book Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, you know? It's just, it would seem like it would be great to live without pain, right? Except that people who are born with no ability to have pain, they're usually dead by the time they're in their 30s or 40s. So these capacities are useful, even though when they get aroused, it's pretty awful. So that's on the side of how evolutionary biology can help psychiatry. The risk for evolutionary psychiatry, though, is trying to make up stories about diseases as if they're useful. Really bad depression is not useful, it's a disease. Schizophrenia is not useful, it's a disease. And people do write papers about, you know, how schizophrenia evolved, but that's all nonsense. The trick for this field growing in a healthy way is to try to figure out not the disease itself as something shaped by natural selection, but what is it about the mind that makes it vulnerable to these particular kinds of failure?
And I like the analogy between medicine and psychiatry and those medical symptoms and also psychiatric symptoms. So there are good reasons for bad feelings, but you also talk a lot about the situational dependence or contextual dependence on like when certain symptoms like anxiety, low mood, for example, are adaptive. Could you maybe talk a little bit about why it's important
Sure.
to look at certain situations?
Right. So after I'd been practicing psychiatry for about 10 years, I realized that what I was doing mostly is helping people get rid of awful emotions. So I thought, well, what are emotions? Why are they there? How are they regulated? And I realized I didn't know. So I spent a whole year just reading about emotions. First, I went to my psychiatry textbooks, and a 1,000-page textbook would have half a page about emotions, which is really indicative of the kind of problem that we're facing here. But after I read for a year, I realized that the way to look at emotions from an evolutionary viewpoint was to understand that each one is shaped to cope with a certain kind of situation that has recurred over evolutionary history. And so therefore, if you want to understand if this person's emotion is useful or normal in this situation right now, you have to analyze the situation. And that makes it more interesting and challenging because, the situation is probably involving a person pursuing a goal of some sort, whether to, get their spouse to quit yelling at them or get their kids to eat their vegetables or try to figure out how to lose money on this, how not to lose money in the stock market. All these things that people are trying to do, they go better, they go worse, and our emotions fluctuate as a function of that. And here's where it gets very interesting, Lorenz. It's not just that the system is either normal or abnormal. It is that normal systems give rise to a whole lot of bad feelings that are useless, even though they're normal. And this insight, I think, is just enormously helpful for patients and physicians and clinical psychologists.
Sorry, do you mean useless in certain situations or feelings generally useless? I missed the
Well,
one part.
the capacities, the systems that evolved to help us regulate our behavior of anxiety and low mood, those are certainly useful. But the question is, why do they keep going off so often when they actually aren't helpful?
Yeah.
Because we're all aware of being anxious all kinds of times when it's not helpful. And we're aware also of feeling low and like not doing anything when in fact we should be doing things. And there's no benefit to feeling low. So the question is, why is it that these responses often go off when they're not useful? And the broad answer to that is the smoke detector principle.
Yeah, and that's another question that I have actually. So, what is the smoke detector principle? I've found it fascinating, and I bet I'm in training for becoming a CBT therapist that I will bring
Oh,
it
yeah.
up to patients eventually. So, what is it, and how is it connected to your book
So
or
how
the thesis?
wonderful how wonderful that you're learning how to become a CBT therapist. Well, let's come back to that for sure, because I think there's an enormous amount that this offers to CBT that has not been mined yet. Are great opportunities for someone who understands evolution and cognitive behavioral therapy. So again, continuing to think while I was treating patients full time in the anxiety disorders clinic at the University of Michigan, why on earth do these responses go off so often when they're useless? And of course, all of us have had the experience of having the smoke detector at home go off sometimes when we're making toast. That's equally useless. And that really got me thinking about, well, how come smoke detectors go off when they're not supposed to? And that got me into somewhat deep mathematical work about something called signal detection theory, which is what engineers use to decide when to set off an alarm and when to count a click on an electric line as a real click versus noise. And it all depends on several things. It depends on the cost of a false alarm. It depends on the cost of not having an alarm when you need an alarm. Those are the two very big things. And the cost, of course, of we got to go to the lion in the savannah. Okay, you're out trying to get water for your family in the evening at a watering hole. All you've got is a wooden spear, and you hear something behind a rock near the watering hole, and it sounds a little bit like "Rrr." So it could be a wild dog or something, or it could be a lion. If it was "Rrr," then you would run because it was a lion. It was "Rrr," then you wouldn't have to be frightened. But a lot of times we have to make decisions under uncertainty. You don't know if it's a lion or not. So what's the cost of fleeing? Well, it's probably about 100 calories, if you really, really want water, and there's a lot of opportunity cost, but maybe it's 200, but it's not that great. So what's the cost of not fleeing if there's actually a lion there? Well, then you're liable to die. And that would be at least 100,000 calories, depending on how big you are. So compare those two, the 100 to 100,000. That's a ratio of 1,000 to 1. So how loud does the noise need to be for it to be wise for you to flee? Well, any noise that indicates a lion is there with a greater probability than 1 in 1,000 means you should run away. But that means that 999 times out of 1,000, it'll be a false alarm and you're running away for nothing. So once I did this calculation, at first I didn't believe it. Didn't seem that something could be so simple. But once I actually grasped it, it really helped me and my patients to realize that false alarms are perfectly normal in an optimal system. And it was just so helpful to my patients to realize that it's not just there's something defective in their brain. It is that they're having a normal response, but it's a false alarm. And that was very helpful to them.
Yeah. So I think many can understand the line example. How would you explain to patients their anxiety, for example, that is triggered by situations where, yeah, there's no lion? How can you connect it to evolutionary principles?
So there are many different kinds of anxiety. You know, there's generalized anxiety and there's anxiety to snakes and the like. There's social anxiety. There's anxiety from heights. And the interesting things about all those different kinds is that each one is for a different kind of dangerous situation. And of course, they're somewhat different. If you are suddenly being chased by a lion, you don't just stand there still, you run. If in fact you're on a high ledge and you're afraid of falling, you don't start running, you in fact stay stock still. So there are different kinds of responses we have depending on the kind of danger that we're experiencing. And the different kinds of anxiety fit very well to those.
Okay, so if we stay a little bit with the smoke detector principle, I thought about emotional reasoning. So I learned in my bachelor, I think, that emotional reasoning means that you basically take your emotions as an argument. For example, you are anxious and then you think, well, being anxious just means that this is dangerous and to be avoided. Or, for example, if you are angry and you say, I'm angry, so that must mean that I'm right in a argument with my partner, for example. So isn't the smoke detector principle also a reason why emotional reasoning is often not the good way to go, at least in those 999 situations?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So emotions are useful, and one of the ways that they're useful is by providing information for us. And the bad feeling itself is part of the information saying, get out of there and don't go back there. And so it's so unfortunate, isn't it? I mean, if only these feelings could just say, you're in a dangerous situation, please take your hand out of the flame, or there may be a lion nearby, so please remove. No, that's not how it works. We just feel awful. And if we didn't have that awful feeling, I don't think it would motivate us in the same way to get out of the situation and to avoid it. It's very unfortunate because often those bad feelings aren't needed. You know, a lot of people take my work pointing out that how emotions, especially bad feelings, are useful. They say, oh, Dr. Nesse says that bad feelings are useful, therefore we shouldn't treat them. Absolutely not. Half of medicine is actually relieving feelings like nausea and pain and fever and cough. And they're normal, they're useful responses, but very often it's perfectly safe to relieve them because they're going off very often, either when they're not needed or more than they're needed.
Yeah, so one way is also in CBT to like make them go down, basically, for example. But if you think of acceptance and mindfulness, for example, isn't also the smoke detector principle pointing to the fruitfulness of those strategies? Because if you have many situations where anxiety, low mood, and so on are not really, let's say, dangerous or detrimental to your goals, for example, then wouldn't it be a good idea to accept those emotions and let them not get in your way, basically? Do you agree?
I completely agree, and it's much easier said than done.
Yeah.
You know, if people could just tell themselves, I mean, imagine, you know, you have an infection in your finger and it hurts like blazes. You can tell yourself, oh, that infection, that pain is not doing me any good. I'm already taking care of my finger. So I'm just going to tell myself, it's just pain. I'm not going to bother about it. Well,
Mm.
that's a good attitude, but it still hurts.
Yeah.
It can help. It can help even physical pain to have this distancing effect and think about it as kind of an objective thing that's not quite centered to your soul, you know?
Mhm.
On the other hand, and I agree with you about the smoke detector principle. It's vastly helpful to my patients to realize that it's a normal response that's going off when it's not needed, instead of just a brain disease. You know, so many patients came to me thinking, oh my God, I have a defect. I'm a
Mhm.
mentally ill person. And yes, it is a mental illness to have panic disorder. But once people recognize that actually it's a positive feedback loop in a normal, useful system, it just helps them so much. And I think with cognitive behavioral therapy, that also is one of the ways we reframe things to
Mhm.
help people get over their excessive anxiety. And now, let me say a little bit more about panic disorder.
Mhm.
For many people, I mean, a panic attack is useful. Panic disorder is not useful. These people have panic attacks every time they go in the grocery store, and very often they end up staying home because every time they go out, they have a panic attack. But very often those attacks are precipitated by fear of fear.
Mhm.
And a lot of times that's set off by a well-meaning doctor. The person goes to the emergency room with a panic attack, and the doctor says, nope, I don't think it's your heart. Probably not. Um, but if it comes back, come back right away. And of course, it always comes back, and the person starts monitoring for high heart rate and shortness of breath and that feeling, that awful feeling. And so when little bits of those symptoms come back, maybe because the person is walking fast, they think, uh-oh, I'm short of breath. Maybe it's happening again. And that fear of it happening again causes more anxiety, which makes it happen again. So here you get a classic vicious cycle where the more you have panic attacks, the more it makes, and I think there's another reason why this works. The system resets itself depending on the dangerousness of your environment. I mean, if every time for the last 4 nights you've gone to the watering hole trying to get water, and there's been a lion there every single time, you'd be very smart to either not go at all or to go with friends and be on the edge of panic at every moment.
Mhm.
On the other hand, if you go 20 more times and it's safe every time, then gradually the system says to you, you know what, it's not that dangerous. You don't have to be on quite such a red alert. And this is what happens with panic patients. If you keep having panic attacks, it often sets the system as if your environment is very, very dangerous. So it sets it to go off very, very easily. And this helps patients. This is very useful in cognitive behavioral therapy. It's kind of the foundation for how I began doing cognitive behavioral therapy after understanding the evolutionary roots of panic. I began telling my patients, yep, the more you have panic attacks that you think might be terrible, the more you're going to be having more panic attacks. And so there are several things we can do. You can either stay in the grocery store until your symptoms reduce, even though it feels awful. That will reset the system to make your inner mind realize that it's safer. Or we can use medications to stop the panic attacks. And patients always say, oh, I don't want to use medications because it's just going to cover over my symptoms. But then when you think about it more deeply, you realize that medications, antidepressants mainly, when they stop the panic attacks for a few months, it makes the mind realize that it's in a safer environment. So very often you can stop the medications and the panic attacks do not come back.
Mhm. So the brain got rewired basically
That's right.
due to the experience that is facilitated through the medication.
Right.
Okay. Um, could we maybe speak about the good reasons for low mood and depression? But first, I would like to quote you because I really liked it. So you say in the book, trying to understand pathological depression without recognizing the evolutionary origins and utility of normal low mood is like trying to understand chronic pain without recognizing the causes and utility of normal pain. Um, yeah, maybe you can talk about the quote too, but what are the good reasons for the bad feeling of low mood and depression?
So let's go back to the turn of the millennium when we were all very hopeful that we would finally find the specific brain causes of these kinds of illnesses. We were doing big brain scans all the time, and most of all, we finally were able to sequence the genome. And we know that your vulnerability to these disorders is strongly influenced by what genes you have. And we know that there must be brain differences. And so all of us in psychiatry were very hopeful that we'd find the genes, we'd find the brain abnormalities, and we'd finally get to the root of these things, as if it was Alzheimer's disease, as if it was, Huntington's chorea. And it's been the most desperate disappointment. I mean, you still see all kinds of pretty pictures in magazines of brains lighting up in different places. But are there any locations in the brain that are specific to depression so you can diagnose somebody? No, they're not. Are there any genes that are specific, common genes that are specific enough that they reliably cause depression or anxiety? No, there aren't. It's been a gigantic disappointment. And I think the problem here is that our schema has been wrong. We've been assuming that the mind is really a machine and there must be some broken part in there that accounts for why these problems exist. But an evolutionary view offers us a viable alternative. It brings in this whole other missing basic science that's used to understand really all other behavior in all other animals. And we begin asking different questions about how does the system work, what it's for, where did it come from, and why is it vulnerable to the kinds of malfunctions. And one reason it's vulnerable is because, for instance, for panic, as we were talking about, it's self-regulating. It becomes more sensitized the more panic attacks you have. It's just a setup for a positive feedback vicious cycle. And I think for most people, anxiety, it's pretty easy to see how anxiety can be useful. The challenge there is to see why it goes haywire. For low mood and depression, though, it's really much harder to see how it's useful. And you'll notice how I'm using the word, instead of just depression, I use the phrase low mood. Because as soon as you say depression these days, because of drug advertisements, most people think, oh my God, depression is always a disorder. Sometimes it is. And sometimes it's normal and useful. And sometimes, just like anxiety, it's normal but useless. And now we come to the core question that really, I think, eventually will give us the answers to depression. And that is, in what situations is low mood useful? Doesn't seem like it could be useful. And by low mood here, I mean, feeling pessimistic, not having any energy, not having any initiative, not wanting to do things, being, just low mood where you just don't think you're going to succeed at anything. Are there ever situations where that's useful? And the answer, if you really think about it for a minute, is sure, especially for our ancestors. I mean, my ancestors on a small island on the coast of Norway in the North Sea, I often imagined them 500 years ago being very enthusiastic in February and going out fishing or trying to find food. I mean, no way. And the ones who went out in February looking for food, all enthusiastic, died and didn't pass on their genes. And those of us who got very gloomy in the middle of the winter and just stayed home and stayed quiet, we survived and our genes survived. And the capacity and tendency for low mood gives a big advantage in that situation. But we should move pretty quickly from foraging examples to what's actually counting in modern lives, which is how we get along with other people and what they think about us and how we're doing in accomplishing various tasks. In that case, there is a generalization that's helpful. And this is really central, I think, for a newer version of cognitive behavioral therapy that doesn't just assume that the person's thinking is not working right, that also looks more into what's going on in the person's life. And that is the person in an unpropitious situation? A propitious situation is one where you put in a little bit of effort and you get a huge payoff. It's like somebody tells you, you know what, we'd like to publish your book so long as you can read it in 1 month. And we're going to give you 200,000 pounds. Whoa, that's a super opportunity. And a lot of people would instantly get energized and stay up all night and do it in 1 month. On the other hand, life is not very often like that. And more often, there are situations where you're trying and trying and trying to do something, and it just isn't working. And my residents in psychiatry tell me that the single most useful thing I've ever taught them is to ask this question of depressed patients. Is there something overwhelmingly important you feel like you're trying to do that just isn't working? You're not making progress. You don't think you can succeed, but you don't think you can quit. And that's the question to see if a person is pursuing an unreachable goal. Because if you want to make people depressed, just have them pursue an unreachable goal. And there's a built-in mechanism that turns off the motivation for activity that's wasted. And you can see how that's useful, right? If you're trying to do something, and again, the problem is that all of us fail at all kinds of things, not only every day, but throughout our lives. And learning how to fail gracefully and make good decisions about when to give up on something and when not is essential. And then we come back to your training as a cognitive behavioral therapist. I find some cognitive behavioral therapists routinely encourage their patients to keep trying no matter what. You know, they say, well, it's the depression that's interfering with your motivation. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for that trick. Actually, you're more capable than you think, and the world is better than you think, and the times are better than you think. And if you just reorganize your thinking, it'll be fine. That's usually true. We do tend to distort things on the negative side in bad circumstances. That's part of how depression, how normal low mood works. On the other hand, the more I practiced for another few decades, I realized that I was being naive in imagining that everybody could accomplish everything. I had one person who was trying to break into country music and working in the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. And she had been a waitress there for 20 years, trying out every week for different kinds of shows and getting coaching and trying to make friends and break into the big scene. And it wasn't working, and she was really depressed. And, you know, saying, oh, you can do it, try harder, quit being depressed, take drugs. You know what? There comes a point when it's not smart to keep trying. In everyday life, it's even more of a problem for millions of people. And what do you do when your marriage isn't very good? Most of the time you should wait, because it's really stupid to stop a marriage because it's not good this month or this year. In fact, I sometimes think that's one of the potential explanations for why ordinary depression might be useful, not just low mood, but actual depression. I mean, if you start thinking your marriage isn't good this month, and then you start thinking, you know what, but probably nobody else is really going to love me either, then you're going to stick around. And usually things come back. It's not good to jump out of a bad situation quickly. And I think one of the benefits of depression can be to keep us in a situation so that we don't just jump out too soon. On the other hand, after a few years go by, and after you keep trying to make things work, often arouses ordinary low mood that escalates into real bad depression. I'll pause here. I know you have lots of other questions.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think it also connects back to why we can't find those brain defects or brain locations that are causing the mental disorder, because you can't find the goal that is not reachable, for example, in the brain of the patient, for example. And it really speaks to this idiosyncratic approach to CBT and the patients.
Yeah, trying to understand individuals as individuals, I think, is really a foundation for all of this. And I'm going to pause here just for a moment. Some people take that little statement I just made about trying to understand whether a person's pursuing an unreachable goal to assume that that's always the problem. And, you know, for hundreds of patients in team meetings, I always keep records of, so what's the problem for this person? And in about a third of cases, for anxiety, there's something they had good reason to be fearful about, or they really were pursuing an unreachable goal. On the other hand, in about a third of cases, for both anxiety and depression, I couldn't find anything wrong that might be arousing those emotions. It was just the way the person was, either because of their genes or their early trauma that they experienced, or because of their physiology. So I think, you know, for those patients, it's really a mistake to go looking too hard for things going on in their lives. And then there's the third of the patients in the middle, where they're sensitive souls, and they tend to get more anxiety and more low mood than other people do, and it's too much. It's not exactly that their brain is broken. It's not exactly that they're in a bad life situation, but it's a combination. And this, I think, is the most common situation that brings people to request help.
Yeah, and even if there are patients with unreachable goals, it's still probably very hard to find out if it's really unreachable and how long you should stick to it. And how, so
I'm so glad you brought that up, because, you know, usually when you find a person pursuing an unreachable goal, there are really good reasons. And you can't just tell them, oh, stop doing that. I mean, Oh, you're spending your life trying to get your kid off drugs and your kid won't even answer the phone. Just stop worrying about your kid. No, I mean, that's awful. You can't do that. So I think what this really does is encourage therapists to, be more patient and sensitive and understanding of the kinds of dilemmas that people get into, and try to help them find a way out if at all possible.
Yeah. Could you I'm feeling that I'm going too quickly through those questions, but could you go into the feeling of anger also a little bit to speak about how there are good reasons for anger, or in which kind of situations anger is good even in our society or modern society, in our situations basically? Yeah.
Again, asking the classic Dr. Nesse question, in what situation is anger useful, changes the view of it. A lot of evolutionary psychologists have written papers about the function of anger. And they say the function of anger is to signal you're about to attack, or the function of anger is to frighten someone. Anger has a lot of different functions, and it also is aroused in different kinds of situations. But the most salient situation, the central one, is being betrayed, where someone has made a commitment to you to do something, and they don't. Or a person has said they're your friend, and you discover that they're talking behind your back badly about you. That's the situation that arouses anger appropriately. So what good can it possibly do getting angry? Well, it signals you better shape up and apologize, or else this relationship is over. That's what anger signals, or that you're going to attack them, even physically, and the like. That's a strong signal to other people that they better pay attention. You're onto them. And now, unfortunately, half the time, anger is a mistake. You assume somebody else is being selfish, and actually they just forgot. You get mad at them because they don't show up for coffee, and you get very angry because they promised they'd meet you for coffee at 3 o'clock. And then you realize that they had to go to the hospital to take care of somebody at the same time. And half the time anger is not useful because it's, a mistaken confusion kind of, and again, we come back to positive feedback again. One of the awkward and awful things about anger is that it feeds on itself. I mean, if you yell at your spouse and you say, how come you didn't? Your spouse is liable to say, I did. And all of a sudden you're off to the races, and this big argument where every person's, accusation of the other leads them to feel betrayed, and you get this escalating anger that often ends up in violence, or saying awful, mean things that harm a relationship. So anger, very often, for similar reasons as anxiety or depression, can be useless. But now we always have to look at people who don't have enough of these negative emotions. So with anxiety, there are people who have what's called hypophobia, not enough normal anxiety. They do not come for treatment, but they're liable to die by going too close to the cliff edge and doing risky and dangerous things that most other people would be frightened of. There are people who don't have enough low mood. So they keep pursuing, things that they're never going to succeed at, and never put their energies towards more productive, useful kinds of activities that they would succeed at. And now we come to anger. There are people who just never experience anger, or at least never express anger. What happens to them? Well, very often they're exploited by other people who are not very nice. And the people who, you often see marriages in which one partner is aggressive and the other partner kind of puts up with it and tries to please them. This is a terrible situation. It goes both ways. Very often the man is the aggressor, but sometimes it's the woman. And it usually ends up with depression for the one who is submitting and putting up with being mistreated. And that usually, the deeper, why doesn't the person leave that situation? Usually there are very good reasons. Very often when someone's putting up with another person not treating them well, it's because they don't have very many good alternatives. There's a small town near where I practiced in Ann Arbor, and almost every week we saw a couple of depressed women in the same circumstance. They had 2 or 3 young children, they had no job, they had an abusive husband, and they had no relatives nearby. I mean, what a setup for being depressed. And they couldn't leave, you see, because who was going to take care of the kids, who would put food on the table, and all the rest. Could those women get angry at their husband and say, you better shape up and quit drinking and bring your money home and quit attacking me, or else I'll leave? They didn't have that option. And so this is one of these social traps that's so common. I wish we had these kinds of situations listed as diagnoses, because those kind of situations are just so common and tragic. And for therapists, it's very important to recognize the reality of such situations and the reality of it being difficult for patients to end those kind of situations.
Yeah, I think it, and you said it earlier already, that it's really important for therapists to acknowledge that. So, because of course you could try to put yourself in the shoes, or have to actually also put yourself in the shoes of your patient, but even then it's probably often hard to realize how how much of a trap it is, or it can be for patients. I mean, sometimes it's sorry.
Well, the best therapists have empathy, and they, just as you say, they kind of put themselves in the shoes of the other person, and they can intuitively feel what's going on in that person. And I always thought early in my career that I had great empathy, and then I met some truly talented therapists who were almost magical in their ability to tune in to other people and what's going on. But I found that an evolutionary approach allowed me to gain more ability to understand what's going on in a person's life in a kind of straightforward question asking way. There are in a lot of research studies, you get asked questions about how much stress are you under and how many bad life events have you had. But those are such cut and dried, impersonal kinds of things. They don't tap into what's actually going on. I mean, you can ask 20 questions of somebody and you never find out, oh, actually, this person is really upset because they're trying to get their kid off drugs and their kid won't even talk with them. That might be the problem at the rid of it. Or you talk to the person, are you under any stress? No, how's your marriage? I guess it's okay. And then when you ask a different series of questions, you find out that the person's spouse hasn't wanted to have sex for the last year, and they don't know what to do about that, and they don't want to leave. So, how can you get at these things? And there are 6 different kinds of resources that people try to pursue in life. And if you ask about each different area systematically, you often find out things that you miss just by asking questions about life events or stress. And I have a little acronym for that. It's called SOCIAL. Shall I just go through those very quickly?
Yeah, sure.
So there are 6 different resources that are really central to our lives, and we have to allocate our effort into pursuing one or the other of them. And there's never enough time and effort to do all of them perfectly. So one thing that keeps us up at night is worrying about, so what should I do tomorrow? And how can I try to solve this problem? S stands for social, and that's a very important resource. It's friends and our status in groups and whether we're valued by others in our groups. O stands for occupation. That's a special kind of status in a group where other people value us enough to pay us for what we're doing. Or if we're not in paid work, other people value us for other kinds of things that we're doing. So that's SO. C stands for children and family and relatives. And of course, nothing is more important evolutionarily than having children and taking good care of them and watching out for their welfare. So we care a lot about how things are going for our children. I stands for income and finances and savings. And those of us who are in secure jobs often have very little empathy for just how stressful it is for people to worry about whether the car goes bad and they can't go to their job and lose their job. And especially in the United States, where we don't have much of a protective safety net, everything is dangerous at every moment financially for many, many people. A stands for abilities and appearance and personal resources and health. And again, what could be more important than staying healthy? And for many young people, especially, appearance is overwhelmingly important. And abilities. I mean, whether you have either the physical skills on the sports field or the intellectual skills to succeed at school, we're constantly trying to develop those skills. And the last L is for love and sex. which is where it all ends up evolutionarily, is having sex and having kids and taking good care of them and passing on genes. So if you go through SOCIAL, and in each area, you just ask, well, how are things going? What are you trying to do? Are you worried about anything? Are there opportunities you see that you might not be pursuing because of other obligations? This has to be done delicately, I think. You don't just blunder in, but you delicately try to understand with a person what it is they're trying to do in life and how it's going. And if there are any situations, especially for depression, where they're trying to do something that just isn't working very well.
Yeah, I like this a lot. And as you pointed out, it's really important to ask more specific questions for each patient. And if you have this grid, if you go through those areas, you have a good chance of finding those things that are really, causing some of the problems. And I also like it because it connects to things like positive psychology, where you also take those fields, and I mean, most of those areas are or can be connected to very positive things in your life, values and goals. And there you can also see how not just like relieving symptoms, but also like going through towards your goals can be well, it helps to go through those areas to achieve those
And
goals.
shifting to a more reachable goal. You don't just tell somebody give up on it. I mean, here's a story that all of the stories in my book, by the way, about patients are distorted and changed so that no one would even recognize themselves. So I'll tell one of the stories from the book that's like that I kind of illustrates this. A young man came to me and he said, he's so depressed and he wasn't doing well in his community college, which is kind of a junior college thing here in the United States. And we went through everything with him, and he said, no, my life is fine. I'm in school, I've got a great girlfriend, I'm living with my parents, and I'm looking forward to things, or I should be looking forward to things, except I'm too depressed to do my work and I'm not doing well in school. And we tried very hard to understand what was going on. Nothing. That was what the resident told me. So I went back in and interviewed the patient myself on a subsequent visit, and I went through everything. I couldn't find anything either. And finally he said again, but I've got this great girlfriend. I said, well, tell me about your girlfriend. And he says, well, she's, really super. I don't think I could ever get anybody as beautiful and talented as her again. I said, well, what's she doing? He said, well, she's still in high school. And I said, well, and you're in college? He says, yeah, it's a junior college. I'm not doing very well. I said, well, you've thought about leaving your college? He says, yeah, but my girlfriend says she'd leave me, and I've got to get a college degree. I said, oh, and you're pretty sure that you have to stay in junior college and you have to keep this girlfriend because you can never get another one good like her again? And he said, well, yeah. And you want to say, hey, and then the best question was, so what's going to happen next year when she graduates from high school? And he said, actually, she says she's going to leave and go to Harvard. I said, so she's going to Harvard. This doesn't seem, are you sure this is going to work out? And he says, it's got to. I'm never going to get somebody else this great. Whoa. I mean, this is such a delicate situation, though, isn't it? I mean, you can't just say to somebody, hey, this isn't going to work. Somebody's grandmother might get away with that, but as a therapist, you can't. So the only thing I was able to say is, gosh, are you sure she's the only one for you? He actually was a very handsome guy. So, you're a handsome, talented guy. Gosh, I wonder what's going to happen. So he came back 3 months later, and he was all chipper. And I said, hey, what's happened? And he said, well, I took the drugs for about a month and then I stopped. I didn't need them anymore. I said, really? How's your mood now? He says, good. It's really good. So I said, well, what about your girlfriend? He said, oh, that's great. That's great. So really, is she going to leave to go to college elsewhere next year? He said, oh, you mean that girlfriend? No. She was too uppity for me. So, people do give up on their goals when they aren't working. And when they turn to something else, life gets better. But that's never easy. It's never easy. And again, I think, especially for cognitive behavioral therapists, it's so important to try to, understand these life situations instead of just assuming. that the cognitions are distorted and the like. There's one cognitive behavioral therapist who I especially appreciate. His name is Leif Kenner. He's a Norwegian, and he's talked about metacognitive behavioral therapy, where instead of just looking at the person's goals and the like in one circumstance, you help the person to understand how the mind actually works and why the mind gets stuck on pursuing things that really aren't working very well. I think that offers great opportunities for the future.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the story you just told also points out the problem of conflicting goals, because it's not always
Yeah,
one goal. You often have like multiple goals, and you can drop one maybe, but not. Or it's really hard to decide which goal to pursue. And in this case, it turned out fine. Okay, so could
but
you?
positive.
So yeah,
Sometimes it doesn't turn out. Sometimes it does not turn out fine.
yeah, that's true.
You also see people trying to find a cure for their cancer. That's a much different
Yeah.
kind of situation, you know.
And of course, also in therapy, you as a therapist, for example, think, okay, this person should probably go for goal A and not goal B, and maybe you find yourself encouraging the person to go for goal A, and then it turns out to be wrong decision. But of course, you
That's
can't
right.
always tell the future.
That's right.
Could you maybe explain the term evolutionary mismatch and how mental disorders or symptoms can be connected to the evolutionary mismatch? I think that's also really interesting.
Right. You know, so all of these systems were designed for people living in small groups, foraging for meat and vegetables on the African savanna. A very different circumstance from these giant media-dominated societies and bureaucracies and universities and the like that we're all embroiled in now. I think in particular for depression, I mean, did anybody ever pursue a goal over 5 to 10 years back then? I don't think so. Getting a PhD, for instance, I mean, ridiculous. People would, you know, pursue a goal for a day or a week or maybe a few months, or maybe a social goal for a year of trying to make certain people appreciate you and the like. But these ideas of specific goals where other people are judging you and you either succeed or you fail, I think that's novel, and it creates all kinds of problems. And then there's the whole issue of mass media and mass society. I mean, people want to be attractive, right? And trying to be an attractive person, if there's, you know, only 4 other people of mating age around within walking distance is one thing. If there's 40 million people all on TikTok showing off their dance moves and their super bodies and things, you are not going to look very good, especially since they've been photoshopped and the like. And then on Facebook, do people put up all kinds of stuff about how they're failing? No. They put up stuff about how their life is great, you know, and the new things they're doing, and none of our lives are as good as those because we keep to ourselves, you know. So I think there are problems that arise from modern society, especially that cause depression, anxiety too. The kinds of social anxiety are instantly worse just in the past 20 years. Used to be you could say something stupid and people would say, what did you say? And then, oh, I didn't mean it, or blah, blah, blah. But now you say something on Twitter and you can lose your job for, you know, a sentence that is misplaced or misunderstood or something like that. So there's all kinds of things about modern societies. And we haven't even talked about the biggest one, which is that how wonderful we've made our society, or at least our culture. What have people always wanted? Food. Tasty food whenever you want it. Now we have tasty food as much as you want, whenever you want it, without costing very much. And most of us are obese, and the rest are trying to lose weight constantly. And then you get into severe dieting and deciding to, you know, lose 10 pounds in the next 2 weeks. And then you get into eating disorders. I'd be glad to talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So eating disorders are the most fatal psychiatric disease. And it's been, you know, there's all kinds of work trying to understand why some people get eating disorders and other people don't. That's the usual medical approach and psychiatric approach to all of these disorders. The evolutionary approach asks a different question. It asks, why are we all vulnerable to eating disorders? And the key here is that, you know, eating disorders are almost always precipitated by severe dieting, where you try to starve yourself. It seems obvious, right? I want to lose weight. I'm just going to eat less. I just use my willpower to eat less. And that works for about a day or two. And then you suddenly find yourself staring at a whole empty half-gallon of ice cream, wondering, what did I do? I didn't mean to eat all that. I lost control. And how do you feel about yourself then? Think, oh my God, I really am out of control. I really am going to become obese. I've got to try harder. And now we're back into one of these positive feedback vicious cycles again, where the more you try to restrict your food intake, the more you end up binging out of control. And not just that goes out of control, but the body has a built-in mechanism that's appropriate for times of famine. The first one is find food and eat it really fast. The second one is ratchet up your average body weight, your set point, a few pounds, because it's worthwhile carrying a few extra pounds if, in fact, food supplies are erratic. Daniel Nettle in the UK has done marvelous work on this with animals as well as humans, pointing out that if you have an erratic food supply, body weight goes up. So this means that those attempts at stopping your food intake actually make your obesity worse. So in both of these ways, losing control of eating and bulimia and your body weight going up, the harder you try to control your eating, the more you get yourself into this vicious spiral of trying hard, controlling your calories, then eating too much, and then your body weight going up. A nasty vicious cycle. It's not this simple, however, because when people get into bad eating disorders, their thoughts get distorted. And there also are some reasons why some people get into eating disorders and others don't. But this at least makes sense out of eating disorders. Instead of just trying to figure out what's wrong with this individual, we see the actual control system for eating and why it gets to malfunction.
Yeah. So there are so many mental disorders and symptoms that can be explained, or at least where evolutionary psychiatry really has to say something. Coming to an end, could you maybe, because you say in the book also that it's not about, like, for example, creating an evolutionary based psychotherapy brand or something, but nevertheless, evolutionary psychiatry can transform treatment. Can you maybe sum up how it has transformed your clinical
Yes.
work?
I'm so glad you brought that up because, there is such a thing as evolutionary psychiatry now, and that makes it sound like there's some new brand of psychotherapy or some new way of practicing medicine. And that's unfortunate because I don't view it that way. It's not like a special brand. It's that you can use evolutionary principles, whether you're doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy or cognitive behavioral therapy or medication therapy or family therapy. It contributes to all of them by giving you this scientific foundation for understanding how normal regulation and emotions work as a foundation for understanding abnormal ones. And just like in the rest of medicine, I think evolutionary psychiatry brings psychiatry much closer to the rest of medicine by pointing out that symptoms are symptoms, not diseases, unless they're dysregulated. For me, it really changed how I practiced in dramatic ways. I mean, first of all, I think it made me more sympathetic with my patients instead of just seeing them as people with disorders that needed to be fixed. It made me try to understand them one by one as individuals and trying to understand their life circumstances while trying very hard to avoid the mistake of assuming that's what's going on in a person's life is responsible for the problems. I think treating everybody really as an individual is just central to all of this. And it also, for my patients and for me, made a lot of the symptoms of anxiety and depression in particular meaningful. Still useless very often, but potentially meaningful. And so you have a certain respect for your own experiences instead of just dumping on yourself and say, quit having those feelings. Instead, we have some respect for those feelings and for our own ideas and references about them. And then there are the practical things like explaining the smoke detector principle to people and helping them to identify things where they might be pursuing unreachable goals, and helping them to see positive feedback cycles and things like eating disorders. I mean, those can be just invaluable for giving patients insights that they can use to change their behavior. Not instant, it doesn't provide an instant cure, doesn't provide an alternative to other kinds of treatment, but it does provide a real scientific foundation that's been missing. So if your listeners would be interested, this field is growing very fast now. The Royal College of Psychiatry in the UK has 2,000 members in its special interest group for evolutionary psychiatry. And two of the leaders of that group, Riyad Abed and Paul St. John Smith, have just finished editing a new book called Evolutionary Psychiatry. It's the first major edited volume about the field. And there are meetings going on where you can talk with other people interested in this. And someone like yourself, who is learning cognitive behavioral therapy, might be very interested in coming to a meeting of the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health, where some people who are pursuing these ideas help to develop them, or get on the mailing list for the EPSIG group. EPSIG stands for the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group. EPSIG.org is the Royal College group, and that's kind of a central clearinghouse for information in the field. I'm very hopeful that it will come and develop fast, but there are risks as well. Because if you just start reading articles about evolutionary psychiatry, you're liable to find some really wild stuff, like maybe anorexia nervosa is an adaptation. Maybe it's useful to have some people run off away from the group and try to find food elsewhere, and that's why anorexics exercise a lot. I mean, actually talking with anorexics realize that they're not running off trying to find food elsewhere. They're trying to keep their weight down, But so there are a lot of things. There are even things about schizophrenia possibly being useful. And this is the biggest mistake in the field of confusing diseases with adaptations and looking for how a disease can be useful. That's wrong in almost all circumstances. So I think for the field to grow in a healthy way, it's going to require really considering hypotheses one by one and testing them and considering them carefully, instead of global things saying an evolutionary approach is good or bad. We need to do it one thing at a time.
Yeah, and this draws back to the first or the second question with viewing mental disorders as adaptations versus viewing symptoms as adaptations. And I think I might be guilty of having thought the same, or at least heard the same, that depression is like an adaptation. As you pointed out, depression depression in the meaning of nowadays, like this full-blown disorder and not low mood. So, and just reading this in your book really opened my eyes, and I hope in evolutionary psychiatry there are, or would you say the percentage is of those people who think like you, viewing symptoms as adaptations, and how many are actually writing those papers and still seeing the whole mental disorders and diseases for the medical cases as adaptations?
I'd hesitate to say. I just think there's so much work to be done. I think we're very early. We're at the dawn of evolutionary psychiatry, and it's foggy out, and the fog is going to take some years to clear. And I'm hoping people with goodwill and good humor kind of work with each other to try to figure out how we all conceptualize these questions and how we test hypotheses. In the meanwhile, it's awfully interesting. There's a lot of smart people working in this area, and more are welcome. I'm eager for people to get in touch with me if they have special interest in this area. I appreciate your efforts to spread the word. But my book is now, I think, available in 15 languages, but the German publisher who was going to do it didn't do it. It collapsed or something, and we're now looking for a new German translation. So if you have any colleagues there who might be interested in doing a translation, or publishers, let me know, because I think there are a lot of people in Germany who would appreciate this. In fact, many of the ideas I've talked about today developed while I was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. They were very generous in giving me a year to work on these ideas, and it was enormously helpful.
Yeah, great. I actually I'm doing a PhD on emotion regulation. I was just thinking about it, because there we also, as you probably know, distinguish or have been distinguishing adaptive and maladaptive emotion regulation strategies. And there also it's getting more and more clear that context or situational dependence is very important, also not for like emotions, but also for deciding which kind of strategies you should implement in what kinds of situations. And there I think it will also give me another perspective, thinking just from an evolutionary viewpoint, and maybe I can try to implement
I'd
it
be
in
very
this way.
interested. Maybe we talk again in a year or two after you pursued that route more. I'd be very interested. I followed the work in emotion regulation very carefully, and I have two comments about it. I mean, everybody's interested in how we can regulate our own emotions, and people don't pay nearly as much attention to how our emotions regulate us.
Could you
The
clarify?
other part of it, we imagine that we can think differently and regulate our emotions. It doesn't work very well. It's not very easy. And the reason is because natural selection has shaped those emotions to do things that are good for our genes. This is a whole topic we haven't talked about, that all of these systems are not shaped for our welfare. They're shaped for our genes' welfare, which is why people get so upset about things having to do with sex and reproduction and the like. So we imagine that we can regulate our emotions by just doing things differently or thinking differently, and we can somewhat. That's important and useful and very beneficial. But we don't think as deeply as we might about how our emotions regulate what we do, and the fact that they do it in the service of our genes. So this is another idea that someone like you could help develop. Just knowing that your emotions are constantly trying to get you to do stuff that's good for your genes but bad for you, it doesn't change the feelings, but it helps a little. And it also helps maintain a sense of humor about the whole thing, which is enormously helpful.
Yeah, there's a lot I will have to think about, but it's really interesting, and also connects somewhat to like how emotions are connected to our goals and are driving our goals and our behaviors towards our goals in both directions. Okay, so I always end these podcasts with two questions. If you have 3 more minutes. The first one is, what are your 3 favorite hobbies?
I like walking and playing with my dog and fishing.
Great. What is normally I have follow-up questions, but I know I want to be respectful of your time. So the last one is, if you would wake up tomorrow and just graduated from high school, what would you do with your life?
So, I've been so fortunate. Things have worked out very much as I had hoped. And I thought that if I spent enough time on one question and one pursuit, gradually I would be able to be useful and pursue things that are interesting, even when I get kind of old. I must say, though, I've just been lucky. And if you ask the chairman, some of them have helped me enormously, but they've always been a bit disappointed that I haven't gone to get big grants from drug companies and things like that. And I've tried to be a good citizen and bring in money for my departments and do things like that. But I've really pursued this one goal of trying to understand why systems fail. And now I'm even expanding it further. I'm working with the National Academy of Engineering to see if these ideas about evolutionary medicine and the 6 reasons why systems are vulnerable to failure might be useful for understanding engineering failures, like the Challenger disaster or when a bridge falls down, and even social failures about why social group and corporations fail. So I've had wonderful conversations with other biologists and engineers who are trying to understand failure in general. And it's thrilling that some of these ideas from basic biology about why systems are vulnerable to failure might be useful elsewhere. And it's a simple idea that I pursued my whole career. Instead of trying to figure out why this system has failed this time, trying to instead understand how did the system get designed in a way that left it vulnerable to failure. I mean, that is such a fascinating question, and we have a lot more work to do to try to figure out how to ask it and how it can be useful in medicine and in other areas. It's just been really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, just to end this, I'm also fascinated by evolution, and I have all kinds of books from different disciplines, and yeah, just those simple ideas and principles, how much they can like spin off in all kinds of fields. It's really interesting. Okay, so Randy, Nesse, thank you so much for taking your time, and yeah, I hope it was
love talking with you. For people who listen to this and don't see anything else, you can find me on the web very easily at nesse.us. And there's more information about the book and lots of links to other things about the field if you're interested.
Yeah, I will also put in the description some links that you refer to. All right.
Great.
Thank you so
Wonderful
much.
talking with you. Another time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.